Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Daniel Profeta. I've been a tabletop role player going on 6 years now, and it is my favorite hobby. It's amazing. I love tabletop role playing, and I want you to join it too. I want you to join the Legion, join the movement, and because it's really fun. Tabletop role playing is an awesome exercise in imagination and collaborative storytelling. So, one question that I get asked all the time is about Dungeons and Dragons and Call of Cthulhu, two of the most well-known tabletop RPGs circulating around right now. There are some others, but these two, in my opinion, are almost polar opposites of each other, and it would be pretty interesting to pit them against each other. So some questions you might have would be, which should I play? What should I start with? As a newcomer to the hobby, what should I do? What should I buy? And this video is going to show you Dungeons and Dragons versus Call of Cthulhu. So you've got, on one hand, Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition specifically, and on the other hand, Call of Cthulhu 7th edition. Now, first off, let's start with a bit of brief history about these two giants in the tabletop role-playing game industry. So first of all, we've got the vastly more popular Dungeons and Dragons. According to Wikipedia, Dungeons & Dragons, commonly abbreviated as D&D, or D&D, is a fantasy tabletop role-playing game, originally designed by Gary Gygax and Dave Aronson. It was first published in 1974 by Tactile Studies Rules Incorporated. The game has been published by Wizards of the Coast since 1997. It was derived from miniature war games with a variation of the 1971 game Chainmail serving as its initial rule system. D&D's publication is commonly recognized as the beginning of modern role-playing games and the role-playing gaming industry. D&D departs from traditional wargaming by allowing each player to create their own character to play instead of a military formation. These characters embark upon imaginary adventures within a fantasy setting. A dungeon master serves as the game's referee and storyteller while maintaining the setting in which the adventures occur, and playing the role of the inhabitants of the game world. The characters form a party, and they interact with the setting's inhabitants and with each other. Together they solve dilemmas, engage in battles, gather treasure and knowledge. In the process, the characters earn experience points in order to rise in levels, and they become increasingly powerful over a series of separate games. There is a lot more to Dungeons and Dragons, but that's a sense of what it is. So it was originally published in 1974, but the most recent edition, 5th edition, was published in 2014 by Wizards of the Coast, which is now a subdivision or whatever of Hasbro. Now, Call of Cthulhu, also according to Wikipedia, is a horror fiction role-playing game based off of H.P. Lovecraft's story of the same name and the associated Cthulhu mythos. This game, often abbreviated as COC, is published by Chaosium. It was first released in 1981 and is currently in its 7th edition with many different versions released. It makes use of Chaosium's basic role-playing system with special rules for sanity. The setting for Call of Cthulhu is a darker version of our world based on H.P. Lovecraft's observation that the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Call of Cthulhu uses the basic role-playing system first developed for RuneQuest and used in other Chaosium games. It is skill-based, with characters getting better with their skills by succeeding at them for as long as they stay functionally healthy and sane. They do not, however, gain hit points and do not become significantly harder to kill. The game does not use levels or leveling up. The original conception of Call of Cthulhu was Dark Worlds, a game commissioned by the publisher Chaosium but never published. Sandy Peterson contacted them regarding writing a supplement for their popular fantasy game RuneQuest set in Lovecraft's Dreamlands. He took over the writing of Call of Cthulhu, and the game was released in 1981. That was the first edition. The most recent edition, which is 7th, was also published in 2014. Again, there's a lot more that goes with Call of Cthulhu, but we're just going to stop it right there and say there's a brief overview of what these two games represent. Now, So the first thing that I think we should look at before we get too deep into this, and there's a lot of differences between them, and this is going to be a bit of a Call of Cthulhu versus Dungeons & Dragons. Which should you play? So let me first point out that for both games, it depends on whether you want to be a player or the storyteller on what you're going to need to buy, what the expenses, because this is a pretty expensive hobby. But, you know, I mean, if you have the money for it, you don't really need to worry about this. But in case you don't, I will say that for Call of Cthulhu, you only need one book. For Dungeons & Dragons, if you're being a player, you only need one book. However, for Call of Cthulhu, if you want to be the player or the storyteller, one book isn't all that's required. The Call of Cthulhu Keeper Rulebook. You can get this for like $40 off of Amazon. For Dungeons & Dragons, to be the storyteller, you're going to need 3 books. And together, this might add up to be like $120 or more. All right? You're going to need the player book, which is all you'll need if you're going to be a player. But the Dungeon Master needs this too because they need to know the rules. Then you've got the actual Dungeon Master's Guide, which is, in my opinion, one of the greatest supplements, or maybe not supplement, but core rulebooks ever written. This is very, very, very inspiring. And then thirdly, you don't this isn't a necessity, but I think it's very useful for Dungeon Masters. It is the Monster Manual. Inside here, you will find the statistics for over 300 different types of monsters. Now, so let's just say Dungeons & Dragons is slightly more expensive than Call of Cthulhu could be, right? And again, that is subjective. So let's look at the fundamental differences between Call of Cthulhu and Dungeons & Dragons. So when you've got Dungeons & Dragons, right? One very, very nitpicky type of detail that's different is that Dungeons & Dragons uses the D20 as its main dice. So all role-playing games, or at least most role-playing games, use dice to determine whether you succeed or fail at something. In Dungeons & Dragons, you have skill. You have, not skills. Maybe they are called skills. I don't know. You have different abilities, whatever, and they give you bonuses. So you'll roll the D20, and let's say you got a 10, and then you would check on your character sheet to see what stats apply to that roll. So, for instance, if you're trying to break down a door within the game, you would roll first. You'd roll, you get a 10, then you add your strength to it because you're trying to push down the door. And you look and you see that your strength is +2. So you add 2 to the roll of 10, and so you've got a total of 12. The Dungeon Master knows that you need a 14 or higher to break down the door, so you fail. That's how the Dungeons & Dragons system works. If you rolled a 17, you add 2, you have 19 now, that would have succeeded and you would have broken down the said door. For Call of Cthulhu, it's a little bit different. You have 2 10-sided die. One 10-sided die is numbered from 0 to 9, and the other is from 00 to 90, going up in increments of 10. You roll them together to generate a number between 1 and 100. You have a skills with a % chance of success, and you try to roll under that % chance. There's no bonuses. It's always, you've got your % chance, you try to roll against it. You try to get under it. And if you get under it, then you've succeeded. Trying to break down the door, you roll for strength. You have a strength of 70. You roll a 73. That is a failure. You roll a 52. That is a success because it's less than 70. Make sense? And you break down the door. One of the reasons I think that everybody should play tabletop role-playing games is because that the games build communication, ingenuity, and problem-solving skills. There's acting and drama, appreciation for how stories are crafted, some historical elements, and pretty much all-round awesomeness. Plus, with Dungeons & Dragons, you've got all this lore taken from J.R.R. Tolkien's world. In Call of Cthulhu, you've got all this lore taken from H.P. Lovecraft's world. It's very, very interesting, really. So, The difference is that D&D is set in a J.R.R. Tolkien-inspired fantasy world with magic and monsters around every corner. Call of Cthulhu, however, is set in the real world. It's a game with atmosphere and mood where an hour of game time might go between overtly magical encounters. Now, huge difference between Dungeons & Dragons and Call of Cthulhu is D&D is probably a little bit more difficult to learn. Dungeons & Dragons is a much more mild game. Call of Cthulhu is a horror game. Dungeons & Dragons is a fantasy game. So Call of Cthulhu is intense and scary, whereas Dungeons & Dragons is supposed to be a lot more mild, fun, adventurous, exciting, humorous even. And in Dungeons & Dragons, unfortunately, the rule system is a lot more difficult to master, whereas in Call of Cthulhu, the rule system is extremely simple. One major difference between Call of Cthulhu and Dungeons & Dragons that you might want to think about is combat realism. In Dungeons & Dragons, when you go to fight something, it'll have 100 hit points, you'll have 120 hit points. You guys will do 5 damage to each other every turn, and it's a lot of stats and rolling, and every turn you're just going through different things. I can't stand the fighting in Dungeons & Dragons. Whereas the fighting in Call of Cthulhu is a lot more intense. You shoot someone, they're dead. Like it does 10 damage and everyone has 6 health. I mean, it's not exactly 6, but everyone has a very small number of hit points and weapons do a ton of damage. Then you've got creatures like Cthulhu, whose the stats for Cthulhu say his main attack is he just automatically kills 3 people. So one huge difference between Dungeons & Dragons and Call of Cthulhu is that D&D is a game where you adventure, then you fight, then you gain rewards for your adventuring and fighting. There's some social interaction mixed in with there. With Call of Cthulhu, you investigate until you come into contact with the horror. Then you either run away or you face it. And if you face it, you will likely die. But if you don't face it and run away, your sanity will slowly chip away until you're faced with the nothingness. So in Call of Cthulhu, the main way to win is to try and figure out how to stop whatever the creature is some way other than fighting. So major difference, D&D was based off of war gaming. Dungeons & Dragons is much more of a fighting, adventurous game, whereas Call of Cthulhu is much more of an investigation, puzzle-solving game. Dungeons & Dragons is battle-focused, fantastical adventure, which is highly unrealistic, where players keep getting stronger and stronger as they level up, eventually resembling gods in might and power. And you gain these spells, which allows you to do ridiculous things, or if you're like someone that doesn't cast spells, you've got all types of these crazy abilities. In Call of Cthulhu, it's more realistic, where players basically, their characters get weaker as they get older. There's no leveling up system at all. There is a few ways to regain sanity and stuff, but in general, you're gonna die. It's a slow downward spiral. Getting killed in Call of Cthulhu is really fun, though. Another huge difference between D&D and Call of Cthulhu is in Dungeons & Dragons, your characters will almost never die. And when they do die, there's magic like the resurrection spell and stuff. You can get attached to your characters and stay playing that character for a really long time. In Call of Cthulhu, your investigators are going to die like flies. They're going to die over and over and over again. You're going to need to make new characters a lot, depending on what type of keeper you've got and what type of choices you make, obviously, as a player. So then it comes down to this. What type of player are you? Do you enjoy fantasy or do you enjoy horror? So you've got Dungeons & Dragons. Let me read you the back of the Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook. The Player's Handbook is the essential reference for every Dungeons & Dragons role player. It contains rules for character creation and advancement, backgrounds and skills, exploration and combat, equipment, spells, and much more. Use this book to create exciting characters from among the most iconic D&D races and classes. Dungeons & Dragons immerses you in a world of adventure. Explore ancient ruins and deadly dungeons. Battle monsters while searching for legendary treasures. Gain experience and power as you trek across uncharted lands with your companions. The world needs heroes. Will you answer the call? Then you've got Call of Cthulhu. Will you stand against the horrors of the night? Whether learned professor, nosy journalist, or hard-hitting detective, investigators need all the help they can get. Let this book be your guide. The Investigator Handbook is an essential player's aid for the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game. Written for those who will be playing the roles of investigators, the Investigator's Handbook contains expanded rules for creating player characters, a wealth of over 100 occupations and skill descriptions, and guidance on getting the most from the game. What's more, there's a range of organizations for your investigator to belong to. Detailed information about classic 1920s setting, equipment and weapons for both 1920s and modern day, and expert tips and advice for all budding investigators. No self-respecting investigator of the Cthulhu mythos should be without it. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. Just from that, you can see the fundamental difference between these two games. They are both role-playing games. That is where the similarities come to a close. Dungeons & Dragons, fantasy. Call of Cthulhu, horror. If you look into both the games, you'll find that Dungeons & Dragons is an epic, fun, fantastical, comedic, even adventurous game where you grow in power and feel more confident in your abilities. It has a slightly more difficult set of rules to master, and it has a lot more expensive books. It's also one con, in my opinion. Not everyone will think this is a con, but for Dungeons & Dragons is run by a company that's Hasbro. It's run by Hasbro, which is, Wizards of the Coast is Hasbro. Or Hasbro is Wizards of the Coast. I don't know. And I can't really support them. They're a huge gaming company that's taking over everything, and all they care about is money. Call of Cthulhu, however, was made by Chaosium, which was an underdog company that took the world by storm and revolutionized the industry. Dungeons & Dragons created the industry. Call of Cthulhu revolutionized it. They are both for very different types of people. Depends on what type of person you are to figure out which one of these two phenomenal games you're going to play. Call of Cthulhu is easier to understand. Call of Cthulhu is also cheaper. Both games are very, very good. Both games have very different systems, but they're both very fun. I've played both for a while now. I've played Dungeons & Dragons way longer than I've been playing Call of Cthulhu. But I feel that I understand both the systems well enough to give an informed opinion on them both. And I will say that Call of Cthulhu more suits my personal tastes, whereas Dungeons & Dragons is just a classic, epic, amazing game. And Call of Cthulhu is a revolutionary, strange, weird, terrifying game. What type of person are you? What type do you want to play? That is how you will know which one you're supposed to get. Which one is better for you? So, in the end, Dungeons & Dragons versus Call of Cthulhu. Let's go over it. Call of Cthulhu wins easiest to understand. Dungeons & Dragons wins most elaborate system. Call of Cthulhu gets best for atmosphere and investigation. Dungeons & Dragons is best for adventure and high excitement, romps through the countryside, fighting orcs and goblins, whereas in Call of Cthulhu, you're normal people trying to escape. Huge difference between Call of Cthulhu and Dungeons and Dragons is in D&D, you are the powerful adventurer. In COC, you are the weak victim. So, what is my final thoughts on this? I say that there are two polar opposites of each other, very different games. I recommend you play them both, really. And then you decide for yourself. If you want my Deathstroke 9's personal opinion, I like Call of Cthulhu better for my personal tastes. If you want the best adventure fantasy game, Dungeons & Dragons. Best horror role-playing game I've played, Call of Cthulhu, right? Which one is better? Why don't you debate that in the comments section below? And I know a lot of my subscribers are fans of Call of Cthulhu, so you D&D people, you need to get down there as soon as you can and go tell them what's what, okay? And I, again, highly suggest you play both of these games before giving your opinion. Finally, thank you very much for watching this whole video. Please like it if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you want to grow as a game master or player and get all the latest tips and tricks. You start now by bleeding out the subscribe button until it turns gray and lifeless.